Spring cleaning in the House of Representatives, plus a new naval blockade in the Persian Gulf. What does it all mean, playlisters? Well, fear not, because we're bringing you into our group chat about politics and the next generation of leaders in Congress. This is Political Playlist Happy Hour.
Welcome to Political Playlist.
All right, are we ready, guys?
Happy Hour.
Happy hour. We fucked that up so bad.
Hey, everybody, and welcome to Political Playlist Happy Hour. I'm Michael Kristoff.
I'm Anna Muskie-Goldwyn.
And we've got affairs going on. We've got alleged sexual assault.
I'm really
we have
sad
a president
I'm really sad
he's-
that Anthony is missing this episode because he had back surgery today, because I feel like he'd have a lot to say. So
yeah, and
shout out,
his recording window profile name would be good.
yeah.
Apparently, according to the president, the Pope is weak on crime.
Sure.
I don't know if you saw that.
Mm-hmm.
We had an AI image of the president as Jesus or a Red Cross doctor. Either or, take your pick. I don't know. Anna, how's your Monday going?
I mean, it's pretty wild. Like, I will say what's so interesting about, obviously, in case people live under a rock, Eric Swalwell has resigned from Congress after the sexual abuse allegations against him. Tony Gonzalez has also resigned from Congress, which, by the way, I will say the allegations against him came out over a month ago. Actually longer than that, but like the real sort of validation of it all came out more than a month ago. And now that Swalwell resigned, he's also resigning because there was pressure from a member of Congress, Anna Paulina Luna, who's a young woman from Florida, to expel both of them, and also to expel two other young members of Congress, Corey Mills, who has a laundry list of allegations against him, a restraining order from an ex-girlfriend because of revenge porn, a 2025 assault allegation from a different ex-girlfriend, an ethics committee investigation with allegations of sexual misconduct, dating violence, and improper financial disclosures. And then we have another young member of Congress, Sheila Turfless McCormick, who is accused of stealing federal disaster funds, laundering the proceeds, and then using the money to support her 2021 congressional campaign. So all I have to say is that I know that we spend all of our time at Political Playlist advocating for young people to be elected for office, but please don't be shitty criminals. Come on.
It's really amazing. I mean, we talked last week about the Eric Swalwell stuff. He was obviously a guest on the show. Wow, has that episode not aged so great? At the time, we loved talking to him. He really was, a rising star in many respects. And, we were talking on text thread over the weekend as all of this, it seems like, this escalated so quickly and seemingly, this was a surprise to me.
It was a surprise to you because you're a man who is not on Instagram with a bunch of female political influencers, but for women who follow politics, there were several influencers who had been talking about this for a little while because they were the ones that the sources had gone to. And I do also just want to shout out to these influencers who, for the most part, are not journalists. And they were gathering information from these women, trying to get journalists involved, trying to make sure that everything had been validated and that they had people coming forward who were truthful. And I just think it speaks to the fact that women need to be in power. They handled this perfectly. They were able to validate things and find reporters who were able to corroborate the stories with journalistic integrity. And I think that the reason that that it came as such a surprise was because they handled it so well. And it was not like leaked information that was sort of able to be, spoken against really easily by his campaign. And it's due to these women, content creators on the internet, who got floods of messages about abuse at the hands of Representative Swalwell.
I think it's important to note he has denied these allegations. His lawyer gave a pretty terrible interview on CNN on Friday. I encourage everybody to watch it.
Denied the allegations, but in the same breath, completely admitted to having affairs in his past and as that somehow that validates like that, oh, if I just admit to being an adulterer, then I didn't do the really bad things.
Well, I think that, like, quite frankly, he has an opportunity to prove these allegations. And, I do think it's interesting that, in the case of Swalwell, he immediately came forward about the extramarital affairs and all of that, and the classic, like, yes, I've made mistakes. By comparison, you look at Tony Gonzalez. He had initially denied having this relationship with his staff members, that then later came out, and he copped to it. But going back to Swalwell here for a sec, I mean, these are serious charges that have now been leveled against him. I think what surprises me is the severity of these charges, and we'll see. And I think, I'm of two minds. And I was talking to a few different women on different sides of the political spectrum over the weekend as all of this was unfolding. And it was really interesting, a lot of, to your anecdotal point about, like, well, you didn't see this coming because you're a dude. And it's like, that was very much a clear, overwhelming sentiment of the different women that I was talking to about this. And I think it's interesting that that really did transcend their differing political parties that these various women are in. But I do think one of the things I kept hearing was, like, yes, we do have to be careful that, like, we don't want to rush to judgment. We want the facts to play out, and we want to be careful that, like, we're not over alleging things if they didn't fully happen, because those sorts of things end up undermining or discouraging future women, and in some cases men, from coming forward about those things. So it was interesting to hear different people talk about, like, yes, like, let's see how this plays out. Let's he does have an opportunity to prove these false. It will be interesting to see if that what level of criminal charges that these rise to. I mean, he has been accused of rape, which is, I think, shocking from the standpoint of, like, that is about as serious a charge as you could level
My
on a congressman.
my only, like, retort to that actually comes in the words of Eric Swalwell that I saw when everything was unfolding with Brett Kavanaugh. And I'm paraphrasing here, but he essentially was doing an interview, and he said, if that many allegations are coming out against you, they're either true or you're the unluckiest guy in the world. And I think I mean, I agree with you in terms of severity of the charges, especially when there's serious criminal charges like rape on the table. But as I said in last week's episode, women I know who have encountered him in professional settings do not speak highly of his demeanor. I think that his senior staff members have come out and say that they, wanted him to resign and do not, feel that he is not at the level of person who should be holding public office. And that, again, in his own words, if there's that many people that have come forward, you can't just view it as a coordinated attack. There's obviously truth to what's being said. And then, to your point, the legal system will show us what truth there is. But I think that we should all be operating under the assumption that there is truth in all of this.
Well, the reporting, I think, I to your earlier comment, I applaud the reporting. I mean, this has been very thorough, very seemingly corroborated, reporting with integrity. And, I think that getting back to the politics of this here, it's very interesting to see him and Gonzalez decide that they are just resigning rather than face expulsion, which I think there's something about keeping your pension and whatnot that factors into that. But it is worth noting that Speaker Johnson can only afford to lose one vote on any measures that are falling along party lines. So,
but then they cancel each other out, which is why I think
right,
it's
exactly,
interesting. which is why I think it's interesting and like notable that Gonzalez did not succumb to initial pressure for him to resign when this stuff came out. But now that Swalwell was going to, he did, so that the balance is still the same, which is just some like annoying inside baseball politicking of it all, because no one who does anything like this should be in Congress or at any level of elected office and power.
What I think is also interesting, given the late nature of this and him dropping out of the governor's race, he will still appear on the ballot in the primaries. It's too late to have his name off there. There is an upcoming debate that he obviously won't be at. This does open up the field a little bit certainly for Democrats, and
we'll do another California governor episode maybe in a couple weeks.
There's
obviously
too much
we're all
going
we're very invested.
Exactly.
And things are gonna change. But shall we go to Iran?
Yes. Playlisters, how to talk about a deal with Iran. Is there going to be a deal? What did the old deal look like? What does a blockade mean? Anna, what the hell's going on in the Middle East?
So this is really born of a question that I found myself asking last night, and then again this morning as I was trying to wrap my head around what was happening in Iran. And it should be noted that I'm not a foreign policy expert. So as I was reading about this deal falling through, which I'm going to go into in a little bit more detail in a second, I was asking myself, what did the Obama deal say? I was kind of like, I don't know the extent of it. I know that there are people.
You mean this guy?
Yeah,
that guy right here?
Yeah. There are people obviously who said that the deal did not go far enough, that Obama had agreed to, that it empowered the regime too much. Then, of course, Trump got rid of it, and there are people that said that that was a dangerous idea. And so as I was reading about these talks falling through and the potential sticking points of the deal, which mainly have to do with nuclear weapons, I was like, so are we going to get a better one, or are we going to get the same? Are we going to get worse? And if it's the same or worse, and now we've gone to war and American soldiers have died, and all of us in California are paying $6 for gas at the gas station. Like, so what was the point, I guess? Was the question let's
remind our listeners, and if maybe they are just hearing this for the first time, that over the weekend, a delegation that included Jared Kushner and famous diplomatic wizard Jared Kushner, and J.D. Vance, and
led by J.D. Vance,
Vance, and Steve Witkoff, and who else? What other heavy hitters were in this CEO delegation?
I feel like the thing that's really notable about this is that J.D. Vance was sent to be the leader of this, because previously Kushner and Witkoff had kind of been Trump's guys in all of these Middle East negotiations. And when talks had fallen through before Trump bombed Iran, now he's obviously decided, okay, we got to send in a better representation of the American government, and we're going to do that through our vice president. Notably, J.D. Vance is somebody who has not, he now has not been against the war in Iran, but leading into the 2024 election and basically at the beginning of Trump's second term, J.D. Vance is someone who did not support foreign intervention. He famously was very against any support of Ukraine in the war against Russia. So I think philosophically, he actually, has bit his tongue, obviously, because he can't say this out loud. But I have to imagine that he's kind of sitting back there thinking, why did we do this? And now he's the one leading these negotiations. And so
I think there's a very clear reason that Jared Kushner is there, which is Trump doesn't trust J.D. Vance, that he's giving J.D. Vance the appearance of him being in control. But we know the training wheels on this bike are Jared and Steve Witkoff.
Interesting.
But anyway, so these talks were happening over the weekend in Pakistan with an Iranian delegation. The only sort of characterization I might change a little bit is that I'm not sure that these talks like ended in disagreement or disaster. It sounds like, at least from the reporting, that the Iranian delegation was not able to really make a decision, like didn't have the authority to agree to a deal. So this was them going back to the supreme leader or whomever is in charge. We still don't have live picture of the supreme leader in recent days, which has caused alarm among a lot in the national security sector in terms of questioning, is he really in control of the country? Who is leading here? So it then seems to be the case that the U.S. then left because there wasn't going to be a deal this weekend, because the Iranians didn't have the authority or the authorization to agree to a deal.
But they also there were sticking points, which
yes,
was
they are
that,
very far apart.
yes, which is that the U.S. and Iran, namely, the U.S. and Iran namely disagree on how Iran should halt its uranium enrichment program. So the U.S. reportedly says it wants a 20-year stoppage on the program. Iran wants something, quote, in the single-digit range. The U.S. also wants Iran to remove highly enriched uranium from the country, but Iranians don't want that. They want the situation to instead be monitored. And they are all under a time clock because the agreed-upon ceasefire does expire next Tuesday, although to your point about it not really falling apart, but rather they need to kind of extend this. There could be an extension of that ceasefire. But what I found really interesting about this is that the Iranians have expressed that they thought that they were close to an agreement. But then Vance came out after this with very strong language, essentially saying, like, no way are we doing any of what they wanted. This is their fault. This is the Iranians, not capitulating to what the U.S. says. And if they don't capitulate, we're going to keep bombing them. So that apparently surprised the Iranians. And I think that, again, kind of shows the disconnect in messaging and reality, whether that's purposeful or that was a misspeak on Vance's part.
Yeah. Well, let me answer your question from earlier about reminding you what was in the 2015 Obama deal, technically known as the JCPOA. This was negotiated in 2015, led by John Kerry and other folks in the government, like our energy secretary, who seems like a pretty good person to involve in nuclear talks. So what this deal, what this deal basically did was, it was a 15-year deal that capped and heavily restricted the amount of uranium, both weapons grade and low grade, that Iran could enrich per year. So it was some very low figure that they were allowed to enrich, but it had to be below a certain point. And this all was with the intention of limiting what they call breakout time. And breakout time is the amount of time it would take to fully enrich uranium to the point where you could then have a nuclear weapon. They wanted a breakout time of at least a year, which these restrictions would enable. So basically, the timeline of all this is that this deal went into effect in 2015. The IAEA, which is the International Atomic Energy Administration, they were the international inspectors who would go in, and they started going in, and they said that Iran was adhering to these terms. The deal came under a lot of political controversy at the time, because a lot of Republicans said it didn't go far enough. It had all these sunset provisions. It relaxed too many sanctions. And then there was this whole sort of, supposed payout, which was refuted and I think proven to be, an old payout that was due to Iran from a Hague tribunal, like from the 70s. But of course, this became great political fodder for Donald Trump and others to run on and say what a terrible deal this was. But the truth of the matter is that the deal was working. These inspectors were let in. A lot of people you talk to now forget that Iran was complying with the deal. Trump in 2018, in May of 2018, basically, however, almost to the day here, he tore the deal up, saying, I'm going to get a better deal. And Iran continued to comply with this deal until about 2019, when it started re-enriching uranium beyond the levels of the deal. It has since continued and now blown past what those restriction levels were. So, when I've talked to a lot of people and I've talked to Democrats and Republicans who have a wildly ranging view of this deal, everybody who I talk to seems to forget that Iran was complying and that they were enriching at such a low level that we were controlling their nuclear program. And I think, this gets lost in the debate right now. When I talk to people who are pro going into Iran, they say, well, they were still enriching. No, they didn't let in inspectors. No, now look at them now. They have so much more uranium and they are close to a nuclear weapon. A lot of that just isn't the case. They're closer. Those aren't the facts. They are closer to a weapon right now because the deal was torn up, the U.S. pulled out, and there was no deal replaced. So that brings us to where we are now, which is they have been enriching at far greater levels. And I think the last 6 weeks have shown us that they now have this whole new weapon to play with. And that weapon is the Strait of Hormuz. So what have you been seeing, hearing, and reading about with regard to this now announced U.S. naval blockade of the Strait?
I mean, the blockade is in place. Trump seemed to say that the blockade was going to stop everything in the Strait. There's been a correction in that the blockade is going to allow ships through as long as they're not traveling between Iranian ports. So the whole point of the blockade is to stop any trade that comes to or directly from Iran, and hopefully, kind of put a squash on the Iranian oil trade. This has inevitably, as one can predict, made oil prices rise again above $100 a barrel. I think that we got below it when the ceasefire started, and now it's gone back up. And so this blockade is sort of trying to be a tool to control, as you said, this new tool that the Iranians have discovered in the Strait of Hormuz. But A, how long can that last? B, there's this huge issue, which is that there's all these mines now under the Strait of Hormuz. So the whole strait has to be demined, because just imagine if you're these oil tankers, there's a lot of risk. Even if Iran says, okay, we're going to open it, there's some sort of agreement with the US, that's still a big risk for these companies to take, not to mention the workers on all of these ships who never thought that they were going to be necessarily risking their lives in such a way to do the work that they're doing. So I think that the blockade has a very clear intention. And I think that, I'll just go back to something that I've sort of felt this whole time, which is that the military is doing a pretty decent job at the thing that they're supposed to be doing in Iran. They bombed the places they needed to bomb. They took out the targets they needed to take out. Now they have the naval blockade with very, courageous and adept sailors dealing with the blockade and whatever that's going to do. But that military might does not make up for any lack of strategy or any lack of prediction of when it might have happened. And so without the diplomacy side of it, this naval blockade isn't really going to do anything for more than a couple days, because I don't think that it's going to put enough pressure on Iran to do anything with the deal. And even if then Trump goes in and starts to bomb infrastructure, which he said that he's going to do, which potentially is a violation of international law if it strikes things like water supply, which technically you can't, or water supply and electrical supply that goes to civilians, then again, you're kind of just going back to the military. And I thought that I think there's been some interesting commentary around this, where I saw this tweet today from Jake Auchincloss, who is a veteran himself. And he said before the war, Trump and Khomeini negotiating over nuclear, straight, free, and open. After the war, Trump and Khomeini negotiating over nuclear, straight, captive, and closed. So it's like,
Yeah.
to my question about the Obama nuclear deal, it's a similar thing where it's like, well, what are we gaining? Like, I'm open to be like, okay, let's make a better deal. Like I would like that as an American to happen. I don't want Iran to have nuclear weapons. I want the Iranian people to be more free, but I don't really understand any progress that has been made potentially diplomatically from way back when Obama did it, but also from 7 weeks ago before Trump started bombing. The progress doesn't seem to be clear. So I'm very curious to see what happens with this deal. And I appreciate you laying that stuff out about the Obama deal, because it does seem that even if the US gets what they want and Iran stops enriching uranium for 20 years, they're still, they've already been able to enrich for almost 10 years now. So, that in the end might even out a little bit. They're probably not going to get 20. They might get 10 when they do the deal with Iran. And then they're going to agree to be monitored, which is exactly what it seemed was happening before. So I feel like I'm not sounding very intelligent, but I'm trying to think of how like a normal person thinks about this, which is like,
right.
What is changing? And I don't know
right.
that
The
much
answer is nothing, and it's likely going to be a worse deal. And here's why. Because when you look at like where we are now, you can say, okay, well, Iran was complying with the deal, and then we pulled out of the deal, and then they stopped complying. Okay, so we can't go back to where we were, right? They have all this newly enriched uranium. They are so much closer to a nuclear weapon. And they now have realized that their greatest bargaining chip is not their nuclear program. It's the Strait of Hormuz. And I think, what I've been finding to be very interesting and frankly, very bold on the part of Iran are all of these like memes that are coming out, and they're coming out from like the embassies, the Iranian embassies
we
in
live
different
in
countries.
such a weird time.
There was one today that came out that said it said Trump for president 2028, and the 2028 was $20 and 28 cents as like a gas price like sign. And I think what is shocking about this administration is how they have seemingly underestimated or just didn't care or just didn't think through what kind of iron grip Iran had actually on the Strait of Hormuz. And I don't think they really recognized how they are dealing with a fundamental religious regime. And to say, oh, well, we changed the regime. No, you didn't. You put in the guy's son who's even more of a hardliner. And
even by the way, if he wasn't, that doesn't solve the problem.
Right, exactly.
Like the idea was, the idea in the beginning was we're going to have regime change, which I think a lot of people have said, and I agree with this, that he thought it would be like Venezuela, where he could go in and there would be enough, lack of discipline within the government that he could kind of go in and make his new relations and sort of take over to whatever result we'll see happens with that. But the thing you have to remember is A, Iran's a much bigger country. B, there's a lot more complicated politics when you're talking about the Middle East. And I think C, like this regime is incredibly powerful and incredibly resilient, I think, what has been shown.
And we now know from excellent reporting that the vice president was vehemently against this. We know that Marco Rubio was like a windsock in a snowstorm. He didn't really care. We know that the CIA director said that this is farcical to think we can pull this off. And Pete Hegseth was like shotgunning beers saying, let's do it, boss.
Yeah.
And it seems as though all of this was really at the behest of Bibi Netanyahu. And so, a lot of Republicans that I talk to are criticizing Democrats, saying they're rooting for the administration to fail. They're rooting for Trump to fail. And I think that is not the case when I talk to Democrats. what the fear among Democrats is that there is no strategy in place here. They haven't actually thought this out, because every military assessment of an attack plan on Iran includes, in very bold letters, the Strait of Hormuz closing and being held captive. And for this administration to think that, to disregard that and then just not really have a plan, to say nothing of what the political ramifications are at home, being that he ran on a president who wasn't going to start new wars. But this idea that there is no strategy, and so now we're in this too far. We can't just leave. This is such a mess. And we now, when we look at what is a possible deal, we have given, at our own doing, so much leverage to Iran and to the regime in this negotiation right now, that to me, it's inconceivable that we get as good of a deal as the JCPOA. I think the reality is that we get something far less strict, and it's going to be anything and everything that Trump needs to be able to come home here, wave it around TV, and sell it like it's a gold-plated building, when in fact it's actually hollow inside.
Yeah,
That's
I
my
mean, I
fear.
would just say that I am rooting for them to succeed, because I want this to be over. And I think
Right,
that
right.
like, when I just think about, I have to go fill up my car with gas because I only have 30 miles left in my gas tank, and I'm like, what the heck? Like, I don't
Yeah.
want to deal with this. And I feel like there are so many people who obviously share that frustration, and it goes so beyond gas. I saw today reporting that in Baltimore, they're talking about they don't have enough fluoride to be supplementing into the water, because fluoride comes from trade in the Middle East, and fluoride is what helps our babies' teeth in, like,
Wow.
especially low-income neighborhoods where there might be some sort of malnourishment. So it's like, it goes so far beyond it that we won't get into right now. But just to one more reaction to what you said is that I feel like I do think that it can be easily misconstrued that people on the left want the Trump administration to fail in everything that they do. And I understand that critique from the right. And by the way, it was also true when Biden or any other Democrat was president.
Very true.
That,
right.
Yeah, right. That
Yeah.
like he passed this big infrastructure act that was going to fund all of these projects that were desperately needed. And Republicans were like, this is
Right.
horrible, even though a bunch of
Right.
Republicans in
Then they
Congress voted
stand
for
at
it.
the ribbon cutting. Yeah.
Exactly. So this is just the way that politics goes, unfortunately. But I do think that when you talk to average people who have some understanding of what's going on, that there is a sense of like, I hope they get a better deal, because then if they don't, what was all this for? Right? Like, why did, at this point, it's like almost a dozen American service members die? Why did costs increase when costs were already high? Why did we further complicate Middle East relations and blow up, by the way, a bunch of foreign relations between those countries in the Middle East that are now fractured for the foreseeable future? And if it doesn't get a better deal, I, as an American, feel like, well, that was all a waste. All of the hardship, both from people losing their lives all the way down to the fact that, in a few months, your vegetables are going to cost more because the cost of fertilizer went up.
Fertilizer's going to go
All of those things were in vain. And I hope that they're not. And so I hope that they can get a better deal, because if they don't, then it was all for nothing. And I think that's how a lot of people felt about the eventual kind of unwinding of the war in Iraq and Afghanistan. So
I think the sad truth, and I'm not a cynical person, I'm an optimistic person, but I think the sad truth is that we're going to see that this was a lot for not a lot of gain. And I think when I hear people talk about how, oh, well, this was just a play to China, this was to deter China, China was getting too involved in Iran. Yes, I think all that is true. And I think what's clear is that this strategy that we have implemented in Iran, whether it is to honestly get a better deal, or whether it is to honestly lead to regime change, or whether it is honestly to help out Israel and other partners in the region, I think, my fear is that this administration has already failed in this endeavor, and that whatever is left is really picking up the pieces to an already shattered vase.
Mm-hmm. Well, we'll see.
Yeah. In the meantime, I'm going to go refill my wine.
Nice. Drink away your sorrows.
Yes,
Thanks,
exactly.
everybody. Cheers.
All right. See ya. Cheers. Anthony, fix your back.